Let's start by opening up with a verse from Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, where it says, "You shall not worship them nor serve them, for I am Hashem your God." And the context of this verse is the Ten Commandments, where the absolute prohibition of idolatry is underscored. Now, in our previous classes on idolatry, we explored the definition of avodah zarah. What is it that makes something idolatrous? We discussed different forms of idolatry and the types of items that you can and what you should not have in the house. We also had a bit of a spiritual history about how idolatry developed from what was at one point in time the most basic and natural understanding of things, which was only one God. This was the this was the understanding of spiritual reality from the beginning of the world, from the creation of the world, and that idolatry was something that developed later. Now we have to ask a question: is the Noahide obligation in the concept of monotheism, does the prohibition of idolatry differ at all for Noahides than from what the Jewish obligation is in terms of idolatry, in terms of avodah zarah? So what we're going to talk about today will build on these discussions, and we are going to explore the concept of shituf, which means associating another entity with God. And we're going to ask if this is actually a violation of the Noahide laws. So let's look at first the Talmudic basis for the prohibition of shituf. When I talk about shituf, we have something that is, let's say, proximate in terms of something that is very questionable, which would be the Trinity, which everybody is probably familiar with. And we've already established that Noahides are prohibited from avodah zarah. But does this prohibition extend to acknowledging God alongside another entity? Very interesting passage in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, page 63a. We have a quote from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who says that anyone who associates the name of heaven with something else is uprooted from the world. As it is said, it's Exodus chapter 22, verse 19, "One who sacrifices to the gods shall be destroyed except for Hashem alone," meaning to say, unless he's making sacrifices only to Hashem, he'll be destroyed. Now, this is also a verse that appears in the laws following the Ten Commandments and establishes that sacrifices must be exclusively to Hashem. We previously discussed how sacrifices in ancient times were the primary form of worship, although we do have I think, a constant record from the time of the creation of Adam of prayer, a basis for prayer, in the sense that there is an ongoing dialogue between human beings and God, right? Which is essentially what prayer is. However, offering a sacrifice to both Hashem and another entity would be considered shituf and would be forbidden. And what's interesting about this statement is that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai stated that anybody who does this will be uprooted from the world. He appears to apply a universal standard prohibiting shituf even for Noahides. So now, the commentaries on the Talmud, those we know as the Rishonim, ask this question as well. Is this something that is forbidden to Noahides? Let's turn to their understanding of this passage. If you look at Tosfot on this piece of Gemara, they point out that there may be biblical precedents for this. Not exactly challenging the statement of Rabbi Shimon's assertion, but citing biblical examples where, interestingly enough, Hashem's name is mentioned alongside another figure. For example, if we look at Judges chapter 7, verse 20, Here we have Gideon's soldiers fighting against Midian. And during their battle against Midian, they mention both Hashem's name and Gideon. I mean, they cry out for Hashem and for Gideon. And by mentioning Gideon alongside Hashem, it appears to grant Gideon a role in the divine success of the mission. We also have an example in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 7. We have spoken against Hashem and against you. They're referring to Moses. Right? The Israelites are confessing their wrongdoing to both God and to Moshe, to Moses, implying sort of a form of shared recognition. What do we do with these verses? How are we supposed to understand this? Now, we spoke before, quoting the Rambam, where we examined whether elevating a prophet like Moses or a judge like Gideon could become idolatrous. And what Tosfot are arguing is that these cases prove that Shituf is not inherently avodah zarah unless it grants divine status to the other entity. In other words, we can look at the verse from Judges. It's a battle cry. As they're recognizing Hashem as being the one who gives success and victory. And they're also mentioning Gideon simply because he is their leader. This is a very common thing for soldiers going to battle to do. And also here, in the case of Numbers chapter 21, verse 7, we've spoken against Hashem and against you. It doesn't mean this. It doesn't mean that they're elevating Moses to the level of God, or that there's any divinity in him whatsoever, other than the fact that, he's the Rabbi of the Israelites. He's the Rabbi of all Klal Yisrael, and he's their rabbi, and therefore, their spiritual guide, the one who has given the Torah to them. And so we also have a piece of advice in Pirkei Avot where it says, let the fear of your teacher be like the fear of heaven. But that doesn't mean that your teacher is God. It just means that as a representative of God's Torah, you're supposed to revere him as well. So that's Tosfot's argument, that this is not necessarily avodah zarah, unless we're actually granting divine status to the other entity. Now, there's another passage in the tractate Bechorot, page 2b. We live spread out across the world. There are different countries that have different customs when it comes to making an oath, let's say. If you have to swear an oath in court, or if in the process of a business transaction, which was very much the case in older eras, that a person would invoke God when signing a document to prove that you are going to be reliable, because you're now bringing in God as a witness to what you are about to do. So Rabbeinu Tam, who's the grandson of Rashi, we find that he permits accepting an oath from a Gentile who invokes both God and another power when it's their custom to do so. See, here's the thing. There was a question in ancient times as to whether you could do business with a non-Jew. I'm saying whether a Jew could do business with a non-Jew, specifically for this reason, that when making promises to each other in a business context, you might cause the non-Jew, who for all intents and purposes is a ben Noach, to, if he's going to make an oath, he might invoke the name of an avodah zarah, might invoke the name of an idol, in which case you would be placing a stumbling block before the blind. So the question is, how do we even enter into business transactions? But we see that there are opinions in the Gemara that That is possible. They're not necessarily doing anything idolatrous. They might just be using expressions that are used in that cultural context. Sometimes when people say, I hope we have the blessings of the gods, I don't think that they actually mean anything pantheistic, or they're just saying something that, that has some literary or poetic value to it. So the key takeaways over here is that, at least according to Tosfot, since Noahides are not explicitly commanded to swear only in God's name, that's not one of the 7 mitzvot. There's a suggestion here that shituf is not prohibited for them. Now, what we understand from this is that a verbal expression of faith is different than an oath. Or let's say, for example, that an oath is not necessarily an act of worship. So you'd have leniencies there. But as we move further in time, we're going to see how this develops. In other words, we will find that this is actually a minority opinion amongst rabbinic authorities. If we look in the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law, where a lot of what has been previously discussed in a theoretical sense has now crystallized into practically applied law, we look at in the section which is called Orach Chaim, section 156, we see that Rabbi Yosef Karl says one should avoid partnerships with idolaters, lest they be required to swear an oath and violate the principle of you shall not let the name of other gods be heard upon your lips. That's a verse in Exodus chapter 23, verse 13. Now, of course, this verse is aimed at Jews, reinforcing the Jewish prohibition against even mentioning the names of idols. Usually we make up something instead of actually articulating the name. It's common when you find, let's say you hear somebody like Rabbi Singer or otherwise will refer to Jesus, because nobody else would know who he's talking about necessarily if he said Yozel or Yoshke, which is what most of us refer to him as, because we don't want to say that name, even though that's not his name, and that's a separate issue. People will say Xmas, they will not say Christmas, right? We have our own names for these things because there is actually a biblical prohibition against uttering the names of foreign deities, let's say. But how does this apply to Noahides? Because again, if the law that we find in the Torah primarily concerns Jews, we have a question as to whether shituf is also forbidden for Noahides. Clearly, what we saw in the Shulchan Aruch is that this is a major problem in terms of entering into business relationships with people who are actually idolaters. Okay? When I said before that in ancient times it was a problem to enter into a business relationship with a non-Jew, I was not referring to non-Jews who are not idolaters. I was talking to non-Jews who specifically are idolaters. And at least according to what we see in this first statement of the Shulchan Aruch, that's a problem. But the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, wrote his glosses or his notes on what was written in the Shulchan Aruch and takes a more lenient view which aligns with what we saw in Tosfot. He says that some permit partnerships with Gentiles in modern times, as they do not swear by idols, but rather associate the name of heaven with something else. And we do not find a specific prohibition for this, since Noahides are not commanded against shituf. This might come as a surprise to you, that there is such a strain in rabbinic opinion that this might not necessarily be a problem, right? Again, do Noahides have the same level of strict monotheism as Jews to the point where something like this, like Shituf, like associating the name of him with something else, like God and King, or God and the Queen, or God save the Queen, right? Is this an issue? At least from this angle, we have support for the idea that Noahides are only prohibited from direct avodah zarah, from direct idolatry. And we spoke about this in previous shiurim, that what is idolatry? Idolatry really is our physical acts. Talked about sacrificing, we talked about libations. Different idols had different instruction manuals as to how you're supposed to go about it. Some of them were quite odd, actually. But any type of worship that would have been associated with sacrifices as required in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, if somebody were to worship an idol in that way, that would constitute the death penalty. That would be the violation of the mitzvah, or the prohibition against idolatry. And that would be something that a Noahide would have to be careful about. But what if a person is just loose-lipped? What if it's just a normal thing in society to bandy these things about? For example, my own relatives, if somebody suddenly cuts them off in traffic, might exclaim, Jesus! You know, I've seen that before. Are they calling out to Jesus? I guarantee you they are not. It is more of a statement of resentment for the driver who just cut them off, or shock and surprise at their behavior or at some other thing that has come out of nowhere. Okay, now let's veer in the other direction. Again, we saw a statement in the Gemara from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that this really has universal application. And we find that there are three different authorities, the Noda B'Yehuda, the Shar Ephraim, and the Me'il Tzedakah. And frankly, most rabbinic authorities have this position that Noahides must uphold strict monotheism, just like Jews. Now, just to go into this in a little bit more depth, okay? The Noda B'Yehuda very much opposes the view of the Ramah, the leniency that we find in that Tosfot and the Ramah, and he argues the following thing, that there is no Talmudic source explicitly stating that Noahides are exempt from the prohibition of Shituf. Also, the principle in Sanhedrin, page 56b, states that whatever a Beit Din, whatever a Jewish rabbinic court would execute a Jew for, a Noahide is also commanded against that. So if Shituf is forbidden for Jews, it should also be forbidden for Noahides. And that the distinction that Tosfot made regarding oaths does not apply to direct worship, meaning that a Noahide who worships God along with another entity still transgresses. Again, this is a major problem when we consider a concept like the Trinity. Now, the debate between these two perspectives has very significant implications, especially for Noahides coming from Christian backgrounds who have left an institution that involved the belief in a triune God or divine intermediaries. Okay, so we have a lenient position, and we have a strict position. What we can say is that for Noahides who are seeking truth, a person who's striving for spiritual purity, let's say, really should avoid Shituf and serve Hashem directly because there is no Talmudic source that exempts Noahides from these things. And again, we have to make a distinction between people who are classified as non-Jews in the generic sense. We call everybody other than Jews B'nai Noach. But there's a difference between a conscious Ben Noach who is devout, so to speak, meaning to say they have consciously taken upon themselves the seven mitzvot, really the seven categories of mitzvot, which when you add them up equal to around 100 mitzvot, and have dedicated themselves essentially to the Jewish religion as it applies to them. There's a difference between that kind of conscious person versus somebody who is not Jewish, who might be genetically a Ben Noach, but has no stake in it. A person who has not dedicated their life to that. Okay, so we might be able to say that the a person who let's say uses these kinds of expressions in a casual way because that's how they're acculturated, we might be able to take the view of the Ramah and of that position in Tosfot that they're not necessarily since this is not actual idol worship. But that's very different than a person who considers themselves a Ben or a Bat Noach, who's really taken that step and has really made Hashem the center of their life. Right? In other words, in other words, let me just rewind a bit. What we're saying here is that there's a halachic precedent to say that a Noahide who believes in Shituf or expresses himself in that way doesn't transgress strict idolatry laws. But on the other hand, somebody who is, a conscious, committed Noahide really should strive for something better than this, for something more pure than this. We have a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which is, "Hear, O Israel, Hashem is our God, Hashem is one." That is the most basic statement of faith in the Jewish religion. While the verse is directed at Israel, it teaches a universal truth. In other words, the idea of monotheism comes from this verse. The idea of there being one only God comes from this verse. So even though it is voiced in terms of an expression to Israel, this is something that is aimed at humanity in general, because this is a truth that applies to all of us. This is the ideal for all of humanity. So our task, whether we're Jewish or Noahide, is to strive for clarity in worship. So, God willing, through deep learning of these things, may we all strengthen our connection to the one true God.